All right, let's dive into one of the most dynamic and honestly contradictory periods in all of U.S. history, Period 8, running from 1945 to 1980. This era is just packed with tension, and today we're going to make sense of it all.
So why should you really lean in for this one? Well, look at that number. Period 8 makes up a huge chunk of your AP exam. We're talking 10 to 17%. So, yeah, mastering these big ideas isn't just a nice to have. You've got to know this stuff cold to nail a top score.
You can think of this era as having two giant bookends. It kicks off in 1945, right as World War II ends, which just catapults America onto the world stage as a superpower. And it wraps up in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, which signals this massive conservative shift that's going to reshape American politics for decades.
If you remember one word for this entire period, make it paradox, seriously. This whole era is defined by these incredible tensions, the push and pull between unbelievable prosperity and power on one side and this constant gnawing anxiety and deep, deep division on the other.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We've got a clear roadmap that's going to hit the 5 major themes you absolutely have to understand to really get what this period is all about. Let's jump into our first paradox, and it's a big one. How could America project this image of incredible, unmatched strength all over the world, while at the very same time, people back home were gripped by this intense, almost suffocating fear?
For basically 40 years, the entire U.S. foreign policy playbook had one core strategy: containment. The idea, which came from a diplomat named George Kennan, was simple but huge. Wherever the Soviets tried to push, the U.S. would push back with firm, relentless pressure. That was the game.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that containment wasn't just one thing. It was like a whole toolkit. You had everything from pumping massive amounts of money into Europe with the Marshall Plan to stabilize it, all the way to the absolutely terrifying logic of MAD, mutual assured destruction, where the only thing keeping the world safe was the guarantee that a nuclear war would destroy everybody.
But while America was flexing its muscles abroad, the government turned its gaze inward, and what resulted was this toxic climate of fear. This was the era of loyalty oaths, Hollywood blacklists, and wild accusations where just a suspicion, not a single piece of evidence, could completely ruin your life.
Okay, on to our next big contradiction. An explosion of wealth that created this massive American middle class. A prosperity that was, at the same time, intentionally and systematically kept away from millions of its own citizens.
I mean, after the war, the American economy just went into overdrive. You had things like the GI Bill sending an entire generation of men to college, and it was all fueled by this brand new consumer culture, built on the magic of credit cards, TV ads, and the dream of owning your own little house in the suburbs. And this quote just nails the dark side of that American dream. Because while the government was helping millions of white families get loans for those suburban homes, other federal agencies were literally drawing red lines on maps around minority neighborhoods. It's a practice called redlining, and it effectively locked black families out of the single biggest engine for building wealth in that era, owning a home. So what happens when you have this kind of systemic injustice? People fight back. And the fight for civil rights was this incredible, multi-front battle. Activists used every tool they had. They fought brilliant legal battles in the courts, they showed incredible courage with direct action on the streets, and they put relentless pressure on Washington to finally pass laws to protect their rights. And here's a really crucial point for the exam. Even after those huge legal victories made segregation, by law, that's de jure segregation, illegal, the fight was nowhere near over. The movement then had to pivot to fight de facto segregation, the segregation that existed in practice, in custom, in the way things actually were, in neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces all over the country. And this brings us to the moment where that whole post-war American consensus just completely comes apart at the seams, is driven by a disastrous war that nobody seemed to know how to win, and a deep, bitter culture war that pitted generations against each other right here at home. You have to remember, Vietnam was the first living room war. For the first time, Americans were seeing the brutal, unfiltered reality of combat on their nightly news. And the huge gap between the government's sunny reports of progress and the shocking images people were seeing with their own eyes created what became known as the credibility gap. It just destroyed public trust.
The war completely changed the power dynamics in Washington. It started with Congress basically handing the president a blank check to do whatever he wanted. It turned for good with the Tet Offensive, a shocking attack that proved the war was far from over. And it ended with Congress trying to claw back its power to declare war with the War Powers Act.
Back home, all the anger and trauma from the war just ignited a firestorm. The anti-war movement merged with this much bigger counterculture, led by young people who started questioning and rejecting every single thing about that clean-cut, conformist, leave-it-to-beaver world they grew up in.
Okay, now for our final paradox, and it might be the most fascinating one of all. It's about the exact moment that American faith in the government's power to solve problems hit its absolute peak, right before that faith came crashing down and opened the door for a whole new political movement.
Think of the mid-1960s as the absolute high-water mark for American liberalism, with President Johnson's Great Society programs, groundbreaking civil rights laws, and a really activist Supreme Court. There was this core belief that the federal government not only could solve the nation's biggest problems, but that it should. But then, the 1970s hit like a perfect storm of crises that just torpedoed that faith. First, you get slammed with stagflation, this miserable mix of a stalled economy and soaring prices. Then, bam, the OPEC oil embargo hits, causing gas shortages and making America feel vulnerable. And the knockout punch? Watergate. A scandal so big it shattered people's faith in the government itself.
And all of that chaos and disillusionment created the perfect opening, a new conservative movement, which had been quietly and methodically building its intellectual foundations and its grassroots army for years, was suddenly ready for its moment, and it seized it.
So let's wrap this all up. We've covered a ton of ground in a really complex period, so let's focus on the biggest, most important themes that you absolutely need to have locked down for your exam. By the time 1980 rolled around, the America that had confidently marched out of World War II was gone. It had been fundamentally transformed, setting the stage for the political and cultural fights that, in many ways, we're still having today. And so I'll leave you with this final thought, something that echoes a famous warning from President Eisenhower. Thinking about everything we've talked about, how do you see the legacy of this era's paradoxes? That constant tension between national security and personal freedom playing out in the world around you right now?